Hey, it's your old pal Lucid Stew again. We're heading back to the recently completed High Plains high-speed rail womp 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 to check out what was left on the cutting room floor and why. If you haven't seen that video, go check it out. Let's start back in Denver at Union Station. This is a rather long establishing shot and zoom in of Denver Union in downtown Denver. The purpose here was to show Denver Union in a downtown context and also give me enough time to talk about the area with the possibility of chopping this footage up. Out of Denver Union, here's another shot to show the station in the context of downtown. In the video, this sequence only lasted a few seconds. However, I made the render much longer to give myself options while editing. It's also worth noting that I ran all of these sequences at 150% speed in the video because I had so much more render than script, and I wanted to be able to show a little more of it. Even still, as you'll see, I actually left the majority of the renders out of the High Plains video. The purpose of the Denver renders was to show distinct speed segments and also the relation to downtown on the way out of the area. These segments were 30 miles per hour close to the station, 110 miles per hour seen here, and then 200 miles per hour when reaching the area where consistent grade separation is more viable. "200 miles per hour starts looking realistic where the commuter A line branches off toward the airport. The grade change here is not realistic, but a tree in the Google Maps data prevented avoiding the A line structure in a visually satisfying way. So I did it in an impossible way that I felt illustrated the idea in a slightly marginally believable way. The main purpose in this shot was to use cars on the nearby street to illustrate the difference in speed with the train at a theoretical 200 miles per hour. On the east side of Aurora, Colorado, I chose to transition from Union Pacific to Interstate 70 right-of-way. This was another sequence I made a lot longer than necessary to provide editing options. Here, we'll cover the entire intersection. I threw in a second train for effect and managed to jump scare myself the first time I watched it. Between this point and just west of Topeka, Kansas, I stuck with 2D maps and I want to explain that choice. Google Maps has two different types of terrain data, with 3D buildings and without. You'll see the transition between the two in a moment. Without buildings, this is visually unsatisfactory when combined with a detailed 3D object like a high-speed rail path or a train. Those maps can still provide some detail, like the 3D terrain here at Junction City going up into the hill toward Topeka. The problem is that structures like overpasses need to be rebuilt, and a lot of time-consuming tree replacement is required to make it halfway decent. In this case, in hindsight, maybe I should have made an exception with this one location. Once through those hills, it becomes a similar situation where I create a much longer sequence than required to give me some flexibility in editing. It just so happened that a lot of the areas that illustrate the script that weren't obstructed by something like an errant tree required a fair amount of overpass. This is fairly time consuming. As a result, the renders on this video took about twice as long as I was expecting, thinking I'd be able to drop tracks next to the freeway and be done with it. The same is true leaving the Interstate 70 right-of-way. Hopefully this didn't start feeling repetitive, because it just so happens that later some of the more interesting areas in the script were elevated by design. The same is also true for transitioning next to Union Pacific right-of-way by the Kansas River. Here I had to make a painful decision to leave in some crappy looking power lines, courtesy of Google, because I needed to illustrate that the high-speed rail tracks were moving from one side of the Union Pacific tracks to the other. And then one more time in Topeka. This portion through Topeka is very long, and it would have been great to include more in the video, but I just didn't have the script for it. One lesson from the Chicago to Detroit video I put out a while ago is that a measurable amount of people watching route videos like the High Plains video don't want to watch long portions of video without monologue. That's one reason I'm putting this together, so those people can have a video, and so people that do want to see all the renders can have one too. Coming out of the Topeka station site toward the south illustrates how compromises need to be made for the presentation. In my reckoning, I had the station further west and the route taking out several buildings, otherwise it intrudes into BNSF right-of-way. However, that doesn't work out at all for the video, and by moving it just a little, I can still render the basic idea. You clearly see I have pillars directly on BNSF tracks, and obviously that wouldn't work in reality. You can also see how the sequence was edited to avoid nonsense elements like the track going directly into the trees here. On the 110 mph render toward Lawrence, I got fixated on rendering as close to the halfway point between Topeka and Lawrence as possible. However, that has no 3D building data, and that pushed me back into the rather large and complicated intersection of Interstates 70 and 470. In hindsight, this did not illustrate the slow, cheap, and easy point very well. To make up for it, I whipped up a quick section closer to Lawrence. This would have been totally adequate with some editing, and it actually looks simple and cheap. The sequence coming into Lawrence is one of the more complicated ones I've done because I needed to figure out a way of driving the train through 3 freeway grade separations and have it not look totally messy. This included things like building new on and off ramps for the freeway. I also had to move the station a little because there is a house and a bunch of trees where I have it on the map. On this bridge sequence exiting Lawrence to Kansas City, I only built it across the river. That's why the camera focus stays the same and it ends somewhat abruptly. Like Lawrence and Topeka, Lawrence to Kansas City has a big hole in the middle lacking 3D buildings. This sequence over the Kansas Turnpike Lawrence service area was the 3D area closest to the midpoint. The Kansas Speedway render here was an exception to the rule of over-rendering. I actually almost made it too short. Part of that was being too lazy to add traffic on Interstate 435, the lack of which would have been an obvious incongruity. Over the river and through the woods, the sequence over the Kansas River was very close to the Kansas Speedway and following levee sequence, so I kept it short. Trees on the east side of the river prevent that continuing as one big sequence. The Kansas River levee sequence in Kansas City, Kansas is a bit deceptive because there are roads on either end that I don't show. The original idea was to have the viaduct fly over those roads about 40 feet above the levee, but that wouldn't have illustrated the idea of it being outside the levee as well. Then coming into Kansas City, which is a pretty long sequence that I had to cut down a lot. I get a lot of comments about various changes or decisions made during these videos, but really the idea of these is to figure out a route, not necessarily the best route or one that could politically happen. Other options will have different costs or travel times, but the basic idea is to imagine what this is like from here to here, and then leave it up to the viewer to decide if the idea in general makes any sense. With Denver to Kansas City in particular, from the video we know that it would need to be very fast to make much sense, and that's not going to come cheap. In reality, 2 tracks and 2 platforms at Kansas City Union Station would be inadequate, but I had to simplify it because it would have been impossible to remodel the entire site. There is a lot of room in the area to work with though, so a high-speed rail station is possible there. That concludes the more in-depth look at the renders for the High-Speed Plains High-Speed Rail video. This was an experiment. Let me know if you'd like to see more video follow-ups like this. I'm still working on the South Central High-Speed Rail Corridor. If I can get that done by August 26th, I'm going to push the September Stews News to September 2nd, since people like complaining about the month attached to the episode so much. But that's all for now. Until next time, I'll see you on that big beautiful freeway.